Fellow Sublime Text fanatics, it has happened completely out of the blue. Last week, Sublime Text 4 officially publicly announced, available on the website for people to try starting this very day. Sublime Text 3 users that haven't heard about this already are going to start seeing update prompts. There is so much stuff to talk about. We can't be wasting time in this introduction. Hello, fellow Sublime Text fanatics. Odan here with the amazing, astounding news that we've been waiting for quite some time. Sublime Text 4 has been publicly announced. Cue the confetti. Now, Sublime Text 4, of course, has been available for a little while in the Sublime Text Discord for about a year and a half now. If you follow here on the channel, well, then you probably know that. And we've done some videos recently going over some of the fantastic things in Sublime Text 4, but now it's publicly available to absolutely everybody, including people that don't have licenses already that want to try it out and see how cool it actually is. So today we're going to go over some of those features. Now, if you look to the window that is sort of scrolling behind me and has been probably for a little while here, there is a lot of stuff in this build of Sublime Text. I mean, a lot of stuff. New features, bug fixes to existing things. Just it's a mind-boggling amount of stuff. Are we going to try to cover all of this in one video? Oh, hells to the no. That is way too much information. So what we're going to be covering in this video is just the highlight bullet points of some of the most exciting new features to be in this build. And we're going to take this from the official public announcement of Sublime Text 4, but we're going to go into this in a little bit more detail so that you know what these things actually mean for you as a user, because the text really doesn't do justice to these particular features. What that means is this. This video is probably going to be a little bit long. I haven't cut it all together yet. I'm not sure how long it's going to be. Probably much longer than the standard videos have been here on the channel. Before you click away, know this, a couple of things. First, down in the description of the video, you're going to find a table of contents for all of the stuff that's in this video. If there's a certain thing that you're interested in, then you can jump right down into that description and click and jump directly to the part of the video that has the information that you would like to know. Of course, I always recommend watching all of my videos because I put a lot of work into them. But nevertheless, the other thing is this. If you have any questions about anything we talk about here in this video, or any of the many changes that are probably even now still scrolling past us on the screen behind me, you can feel free to drop down into the comment section below this video and leave a question there, and we will cover that in an upcoming video. And in order to make sure that you see that video when it arrives, you probably want to, as you're heading on down there, if you haven't already done so, use the buttons down below my head to thumb, subscribe, and share, and ring the bell notification icon. Then you'll know when it happens. And with that out of the way, let's jump into this beast of an update. The first thing we're going to talk about here is something we've actually talked about in a previous video, which is linked down in the description below. You know how we do stuff here on the channel, and that is changes to licenses in Sublime Text. Previously, licenses to Sublime were tied to a major version number. So buy Sublime Text version 2 and get all versions of Sublime Text version 2, and when Sublime Text 3 comes out, you have to pay an upgrade fee to get access to the Sublime Text 3 builds. This is how a lot of software works. A problem with this is that at the point where you want to upgrade, you're going to have to be spending your hard-earned cash, and in order to do that, you're probably going to want good value for dollar out of the money that you're putting into the new update, which means that the developer of said software, Sublime HQ in this case, has to make sure that they are putting a lot of high-quality features in, which means that they have to wait for a lot of features to build up to make it worth your while to do the upgrade in the first place. And that means that there's a longer lead time between major versions of Sublime Text. And that is a bummer because we would really like to put more frequent updates out. But how do you charge for something like that? And the answer is the new licensing scheme for Sublime Text 4 going on, or just Sublime Text because it doesn't have a version number. We've also talked about that in the previous video on the channel. And that is to say that when you purchase a license to Sublime Text, your license is for a 3-year period from the time that you purchased it. All updates that appear inside of that period you have access to. At the end of the 3 years, this is not a subscription. You still have access to every build that came out while your 3 years of license was in effect. If you would like to continue getting more updates, then you need to re-up your license. And what this means for you is that features and builds for Sublime Text will be coming on a much more regular basis because they no longer have to be gated behind the mechanism of making it worth your while to pay one lump sum. They're just going to be a continuous stream of updates. And doesn't that sound nice? The first thing we're going to talk about here is the tab multi-select functionality, a great new feature in Sublime Text 4. This could be a real game changer to how you work with your files and navigate through them on a day-to-day basis. Now, if you've used Sublime for any length of time, you'll know that you can split the window into a variety of different layouts. You start with the single column layout, but you can make that 2 columns or 3 columns or 4 columns. You could do 2 rows, or you could do a 4x4 arrangement if you want to do something like that. You can even use the origami package to come up with any layout that you might like. That's, of course, something we've covered on a previous video on the channel. And this is great for what it is because you sometimes need to refer to multiple files at the same time, and having them open in a split view, something like this, is a very natural way to do something like that. However, this can sort of slow you down. Now, if you think about this, it's sort of an afterthought as you're working with a project that you're going to need a specific layout, and you have to take the action to make that layout. And then you have to take the action to put the files that you want into the appropriate portions of said layout. As they're being opened, you might need to be moving them around. And sure, you could use key bindings for that, particularly if you happen to be using origami, although there are other key bindings for that as well. Or you could use the mouse. All of those things are slowing you down when it could be a lot more seamless. And to that end, enter Tab Multi-Select. Now, as the name suggests here, this allows you to select multiple tabs. And when you do that, the view automatically splits to show you the contents of all files that are currently selected. This could be 2 or even more. The limit is really up to you and the limits of the space that you have in the monitor. Now, this does play nicely with the file panes that you're used to and the file groups that you're used to. Any splits that happen will be constrained inside of the group that you're currently using. You may find that you don't really want to use groups anymore if you're used to something like a split group, because now it's a lot more easy and seamless to do something like that in a more natural workflow. This may take a little bit of getting used to if you've never worked this way before, but if you're new to this, if you're new to Sublime Text 4, or you're a veteran user, but you just haven't really gone down this path, I would urge you to try this out and see what it can do for you, because it could really open a lot of doors. Now, how do we actually get this going? Well, there are a lot of ways to do this because the tab multi-selection is a first-class citizen in the user interface in Sublime Text. And what that means is any way that you could conceivably select multiple things will actually work for you, which means, say, for example, over in the sidebar, you could click on a file and then control-click on another file, or command-click, depending on the operating system that you're using. This is an operating system-specific thing. And when you do that, you get 2 selected files, so you have 2 selected tabs and they will display. And you could even do that with a third one if you like. Now, if you had other files that were also open, then those are still, of course, available, and you can easily switch between tabs in the group by using the associated key bindings for this. And you can also use the standard tab navigation mechanisms, and in that case, if there are tabs that are in the selection, they will all act as one group. So you can jump from a split view to a single file and back to a split view with just a single key press, which is absolutely amazing. Of course, if you don't want to do this from the sidebar, you can also do this if you have tabs that just happen to be open already. You can go ahead and just click on those and multiple select them, the same as you would have done in the sidebar with the exact same mouse combination of control click or command click, depending on your operating system. And it goes beyond that as well, because this will also work from the Go to Anything panel as well, which is a simple key press while you're hitting the key to open a file. You can have that file open normally. You can have it be added and split the view. Options are there for stuff like this as well. This also appears in the standard definition pop-up and reference pop-up that you see when you hover the mouse over symbols, allowing you to, for the first time ever, not only jump directly to the definition, but actually split the view to be able to see where the definition is coming from or where the reference is, and then easily jump directly back without having to have a split. And this works here a variety of ways as well. There's a dedicated icon you can click with the mouse, and you can also click on the name using various key combinations and modifiers to change what it does. And if you hover the mouse over them, it'll tell you what those are. And of course, what we've seen here is a lot of mouse-related actions, but not all of us like to use the mouse. Some of us like to use the keyboard. And although we have seen some things are keyboard-related here, there are others, because there are key bindings for going to definitions and going to references. This will work for those as well. And if you look in the selection menu under tab selection, you'll find the commands and the associated key bindings that allow you to add tabs to selections, remove tabs from selections, and all of that other good stuff. This is where you spend a little bit of time putting into this, and you could really reap the benefits and workflow and be working that much faster in Sublime Text. And, you know, we're all about being sublime. The next thing we're going to talk about here, unfortunately, I can't demonstrate here in the video. I'm just going to talk about it instead because I don't have the requisite hardware, and that is ARM64 support. And why is that relevant? Well, if you happen to be the lucky owner of an Apple M1, aka Apple Silicone, then good news because Sublime Text 4 natively supports that device. If you don't have an Apple M1, not to worry because the builds of Sublime Text 4 macOS that you can find available on the website support both different architectures out of the box. Whether you have an older Mac or a new Mac, there's no special download, just download Sublime Text 4 and it will work on your system. And if you happen to have a Linux device running on an ARM64 processor, say for example a Raspberry Pi, well, good news because you can now run Sublime Text on those as well. In fact, I think, don't quote me on this, I think someone might have actually gotten it running on a Pine phone. With this fresh new build of Sublime Text comes a fresh new visual look as well, which is nice because that means that we have some eye candy to go with our new toy. And that's why the next thing we're talking about is a UI refresh in Sublime Text 4. There's a lot of stuff that's happened in front of the hood and under the hood to make Sublime look better than it ever has before and perform better than it ever has before and be more customizable than it ever has been before as well. Now, this is something we've actually talked about in a previous video, which I'm going to link for your reference down in the description of this video because we don't want this one to be a million minutes long. And that one goes into more detail into how you can get at some of the stuff we're going to be talking about here. But it is important to note this. Everything we're talking about here is related to the application theme. There are two themes that ship with Sublime Text, default and adaptive. Everything we're talking about here will work in those themes. If you're seeing any weirdness with anything we're talking about in this section of the video that doesn't apply, are you using a third-party theme? Try switching to the adaptive or default theme to see if the problem persists, because third-party themes may need some updating to work with Sublime Text 4. That's all we're going to say about that. Now let's go ahead and talk about this starting from the top of the window down, because historically only macOS versions of Sublime Text had the ability to style the title bar of the window, but that is now possible on Linux and on Windows as well, controlled of course by the theme. Now if you're on Windows, this means that you can have a custom colored title bar to make everything look more cohesive, and as a part of that operation, the menu bar will be removed and replaced with a hamburger icon, this 3 dots. The same menu is still there. It's still accessible the exact same way. It's just not a visible menu bar. You can still get at it. You probably want to use key bindings in the command palette again, but nevertheless, that is there. Moving further on down, we can see that there's actually been some changes to the tabs as well. There's now 3 different tab shapes you can use. There's the rounded corner tabs, there's the square tabs, and there's also, if you prefer them, the angled tabs instead of Sublime Text 3 if you like that retro look. And this, of course, is also customizable by custom themes as well. That's just how these work. Now, in addition to that, a big new feature, particularly as it relates to stuff we've already talked about with wanting to look at multiple files at the same time, can be kind of confusing if you have more than one file open, which one has the cursor in it and where your typing is going to go. And that's why there is now support for inactive pane dimming, such that you can always tell if there's multiple files open, which one is the one that has the cursor inside of it, which has been a lifesaver and really sped up my workflow a fair bit. I don't have to look around for a second to see where I left things when I come back from getting my 20th cup of coffee after a long meeting at work. The other big news here is that the themes can also be set to be a light theme and a dark theme and automatically switch if your operating system supports the notion of a light mode and a dark mode, which means if you were to set up the appropriate settings, then when you switch your operating system manually from light to dark or back, Sublime will follow suit. And if your operating system or some external tool modifies that setting for you, say on the time of day, then Sublime will update itself as well, which is a handy thing to have. If you sometimes like a light theme, I personally always provide the dark theme. And this doesn't just apply to themes, it also applies to color schemes as well. It's possible for you to specify a light color scheme and a dark color scheme and have Sublime Text automatically flip between them the same way that it would for the theme. And while we're talking about color schemes, I should also point out that the default color scheme has changed. In Sublime Text 3, it was Monokai. Now it's Mariana. Monokai is still there in Sublime Text 4. If you prefer that as a color scheme, you can, of course, use it. You can keep using the color schemes that you're currently using as well. You don't have to use this. This is just for those of us that stick to the default color scheme. Now, the reason for this switch has everything to do with the scopes that are used in color schemes to apply syntax highlighting. The ones in Mariana are much more enhanced over those of Monachi. The developers didn't want to touch that because it has been around so long. So if you are a Monachi user, you might want to give Mariana a chance to see if there's some exciting new syntax highlighting that you are missing out on that you didn't already know about. The next thing we're going to talk about here is the auto-completion system in Sublime Text 4, which has received an extreme overhaul, to put it mildly. There's way more than we could possibly talk about in this video, or maybe even in a couple of videos, so this is going to be the topic of a future video, and so you know the drill. Buttons down below my head, thumb, subscribe, share, bell notification, etc. If you want that information, it will be forthcoming. Let's just talk about some of the highlights here to whet your appetite for why, if you haven't already gotten on the Sublime Text 4 bandwagon, you should run, not walk, to your nearest browser and give it a little bit of a look-see. The first thing to talk about here is that in Sublime Text 3, completions are sourced from files that happen to be open in the window, but in Sublime Text 4, they're sourced from the project index as a whole, which means if you have a folder open in the sidebar, you can get completions out of all of the files in said project, even if you don't happen to be actively editing them right now, which can, of course, be a major time saver. Now, when you actually get to looking at the auto-completion panel, you might notice that there's a lot of visual changes in here. Now, not all of the information that we see here will apply to all completions. This is on a completion by completion basis, so some completions are simple enough to not have the information we're talking about here. They could be being sourced from an older plugin that was meant for Sublime Text 3, which doesn't support some of the new features yet. Autocomplete will still work. You just won't see some of the stuff we're talking about right here, which includes things like this kind information along the left-hand side, which gives you a clue about what the completion is actually supposed to be. So if there are several completions with similar names, but you know that they have different types, then it can be very easy to find the one that you're actually looking for. There's also various annotations in here. We might be able to see a little more information about what a completion is actually going to do when it gets injected, or what text it's actually going to insert, which can be a huge time saver. If there's something that's a snippet, of course you're going to be able to tell that it's a snippet. And speaking of that, there are now settings to hide snippets from the auto-completion if you don't want them to be in there. And if you're one of those people that uses a third-party package or your own language snippets and you don't want to use ones that ship with Sublime Text by default, it used to be a pain to have to get rid of those. Now it's super easy because there's a setting that allows you to do that as well. But perhaps the most exciting part of the auto-completion system, at least for me, is the context-aware nature of it. It's mentioned in the blog post. What does that actually mean? It means that Sublime uses heuristics on the symbols that it's providing on auto-completions for to try and help you out with things. For example, you might know that if you have a variable, you can auto-complete the name of said variable and you'll get it. But now, in Sublime Text 4, there's more context on this. So if you were to auto-complete the name of a function, and Sublime knows that it's a function and has seen this symbol with parentheses after it before, then when the auto-completion comes in, it will automatically insert the parentheses for you, saving you valuable time. But it's even smarter than that, because if you were to, for example, auto-complete a symbol for a function that takes an argument, then Sublime knows that it has seen information inside of the parentheses, and when the completion pops in, it'll automatically put the cursor inside so you can autocomplete the function name and immediately start typing the arguments for this thing. And it gets even better than that, because let's say you had a variable that you assign from a certain set of values. Sublime might just notice that particular fact, and then when it comes time to autocomplete the value for said variable, it might just automatically take those commonly used values and put them up near the top of the autocompletion list to make your life that much easier yet again. The autocompletion system in Sublime Text has become very enhanced indeed. Now here's a new feature of Sublime Text 4 that's really going to entice those web developers amongst us, because TypeScript, JSX, and TSX are now languages that are supported out of the box in Sublime Text. Now what do we actually mean by that? Because we have seen a little bit of confusion about this. What we're talking about here is the fact that in Sublime Text 3, these languages were not supported out of the box in Sublime Text. It required you to go and install some third-party package or third-party syntax in order to get syntax highlighting and integrate those those languages into Sublime Text. That is no longer the case. Those are now first-class packages that ship directly with Sublime Text. With those, you get all of the power of Sublime Text as it comes out of the box for files of that type, which includes things like symbol indexing, symbol navigation, go-to definition, and everything related to that. If you're used to having a little bit more intelligence with tools like this, such as being told when there are problems in your code via linters, or having the ability to look up function signatures and documentation, that's not something that's supported here because that's not something that Sublime supports out of the box in general. However, the LSP package is something that you can install that will allow you to have access to that. And we're going to talk more about that in just a minute. Now, since we're talking about adding new languages to Sublime Text, it behooves us to talk about the next feature that we're going to be covering here in this video, and that is the super-powered syntax definitions. Now, this sounds a little bit like hyperbole, but I think you'll agree when we're done talking about this, there really have been some massive, massive improvements. This is a pretty worthy moniker for this. Now, if you're unfamiliar with what a syntax actually is in Sublime Text, put very simply, it's a set of rules that allow Sublime to look at and interpret the contents of any file that you happen to be editing to know what the different parts of it are, like what's a string, what's a function, what's a number, what's an HTML tag, what's a CSS attribute, and so on. This information is used all through Sublime for a variety of reasons, perhaps the most obvious being syntax highlighting, but it's also used for other things like making key bindings only work in certain types of files, controlling where snippets and completions go, and controlling when a build system is available or not. It really is a core concept in Sublime Text, and it's received a facelift across the board. First of all, there have been massive performance increases. Syntaxes load faster than they ever have before, and they take less memory than they ever have before as well. For the more technically minded among us who may be working on our own syntaxes, there's a new feature called Extend, which allows you to create a new syntax by extending an existing one and adding rules on. This can make creating syntaxes a lot easier if you have multiple different types of files that need to share a lot of constructs. It's also a cool way for people to be able to create extended versions of existing syntaxes to add a little bit of new features to them that they might want. So there's some great stuff to be had there as well. But perhaps the biggest fix here is for non-deterministic parsing and multi-line constructs. It's mentioned, I read that directly out of the changelog, which I have on the screen in front of me right below the camera. What does that actually mean for the layman? Well, to talk about that, we have to get technical, but only slightly and only for a moment. See, as I said, syntaxes in Sublime Text are a list of rules that tell it how to examine a file. And in Sublime Text 3, it does that from the top of the file down, and once it has decided what the content of a line is based on examining everything that came before it in the file, that is locked in. Which means if you have a situation where on line 3 something tells you about what line 2 was supposed to represent, in Sublime Text 3, it's too late. It can't go back and fix it because it's already made its decision. That is what we mean when we talk about the non-deterministic parsing and multi-line constructs. Because in Sublime Text 4, we actually have the ability in the syntax to scan along through the file, happily deciding on things, hit a point later in the file, realize now that we've seen something that we made a terrible mistake previously, and rewind ourselves back up and take another pass at that and see if we can't make a better choice about how that's supposed to work with the information we now have available. Some very simple examples of that are these. First of all, you might know if you use Markdown that headers can be specified in a few different ways, and one of them is to have a line underneath the heading that marks it as a heading. In Sublime Text 3, that doesn't work because by the time it sees the line that says that what it's looking at is the heading, it's too late. It already decided what the text above actually is. So that's nothing that can be done. Or take, for example, this contrived code snippet from JavaScript, which has an arrow function, which does not highlight properly in the second case. In the first case, it does. In the second case, it doesn't. And that's because in the second case, the clue, the arrow that tells it that this is actually a function, happens further down in lines. And thus, by the time it gets there, it doesn't know that that's what it actually is. But in Sublime Text 4, we actually have the ability, once we get to that part, to go, oh, hey, wait a minute, this isn't what I thought it was. This is something different, and wind its way back and get another crack at the cat, if you will. All of these things taken together mean that syntax highlighting is much, much better than it has ever been before. And in fact, these features that we just talked about are really what makes functionalities like TSX and JSX and TypeScript really possible to a degree that it's never been possible before in Sublime Text. This next feature is going to be of great benefit to those of us that have ridiculously huge monitors or are getting ridiculously huge monitors, except for those of us that are in the middle of creating a YouTube video for which a ridiculously huge monitor isn't really the best option, and that is hardware acceleration of rendering. Now, this is something that has kind of sort of been supported in the past a little bit on some platforms. In Sublime Text 3, all rendering is done in software, no matter what the platform, whether you're on Windows, Mac OS, or Linux. Sublime Text 3 is compositing what it's going to put on the screen in software. On Mac OS, there was an option that would use hardware acceleration to take that information that was generated by software and move it to the screen. In Sublime Text 4, that's all changed. All platforms, Windows, Mac OS, and Linux, have hardware acceleration via OpenGL all the way through the render pipeline, which means if you have one of those ridiculously huge monitors, you can push the pixels through and get fast, smooth scrolling now in a way that you may not have been able to using Sublime Text 3. Now, this hardware acceleration is done through the use of OpenGL for a couple of reasons. One of those being that it is the lowest common denominator of graphics acceleration that exists across all three platforms, which, for an initial build at least, makes the operation take less platform-specific code. The other reason is that the developers would have liked to use Vulkan, but it's not supported in any meaningful way on macOS. So hardware acceleration is enabled by default on macOS. It's not enabled by default on Windows and Linux, although you can enable it there via the settings. Check the preferences, and remember that when you change the value of this setting to true or false, whichever way you change the setting, you need to restart Sublime for this setting to take effect. Now, when you have acceleration turned on, the information about the graphics card that's being used will be up at the top of the console. So that's a good way to check if hardware acceleration is actually enabled. And something else to note is that it is possible that there might be a driver bug on your system that causes things to not display correctly. So the first thing to try is turning off acceleration to see if that solves your rendering issue. And then after that, check if your graphics drivers perhaps might need a little bit of an update, because that might solve the problem too. The next feature we're going to talk about here is something that is near and dear to my heart as a developer of plugins and packages for Sublime Text, but trust me, it still impacts you and everybody else in the Sublime Text ecosystem, even if that doesn't fit you, and that is the updated and enhanced Python API for Sublime Text. Now, plugins in Sublime Text are written in the Python programming language, and they're executed inside of an embedded Python interpreter that ships directly with and is inside of Sublime Text. Now, for versions of Sublime Text 3, that was running a Python version 3.3, which, if you're unaware, is rather long in the tooth up to this point. And it's remained that way for a very long time because the authors of Sublime Text are very cognizant of compatibility. They don't want to have the greater ecosystem of packages that are available for Sublime Text to suddenly break because they decided to change the Python version to make it a little bit newer. And that is indeed something to be worried about for a variety of technical reasons that we don't have to go into at this particular juncture. Suffice it to say, there have been a lot of enhancements in this area in Sublime Text 4, and one of those is the inclusion of a second Python interpreter running Python version 3.8, one of the newer versions of Python. Now, if you're a Python developer, you might be saying that's not the latest version of Python, and you would be correct. And the reason that that's not the latest version of Python has everything to do with the version requirements and operating systems supported by newer versions of Python, and how that excludes operating systems and versions of those operating systems that Sublime is still actively trying to target. So for the foreseeable future, we're going to be using Python 3.8 for newly created plugins. But this has opened the door for us to have even newer versions of Python down the line. There's now a mechanism in place. Now, I said a second ago that Sublime authors are very cognizant of making sure that everything remains compatible. For that reason, existing packages and plugins all in the ecosystem, all through the world of Sublime Text, will continue to run in what we refer to as the legacy plugin host, running the exact same version of Python as Sublime Text 3 was, which allows those plugins to continue to work exactly the way that they always have. But as new packages are developed or as old packages are updated for Sublime Text 4, should they need that, because not all packages do, then package authors can opt to have their plugins run in the newer plugin host. And going forward, we could also add newer versions of Python as well. So we're really in a good position for something like that. The other technical aspect of this is that there has been a ton of new API elements added to Sublime Text to give it many more capabilities. And prime among these are the talks that went on between the developers of Sublime Text and the developers of the LSP package, which provides code intelligence for Sublime Text on par with that is provided by Visual Studio, because it uses the same back-end logic. That API extension has made LSP perform even better in Sublime Text 4 than it does in Sublime Text 3. And as we mentioned previously, if you're one of those developers that's using JavaScript, TypeScript, or really any language, you may want to, if you want that level of code intelligence, give LSP a try, because it is an amazing package. The last thing to talk about here in the video, and the last thing that's talked about in the public release announcement, is the idea of compatibility. And we're happy to say, of course, that Sublime Text 4 is fully compatible with Sublime Text 3, as we just discussed in the topic on the API. The developers of Sublime Text really want to make sure that everything remains as compatible as possible across the board for everybody. And so Sublime Text 4 is fully compatible with Sublime Text 3. If you run Sublime Text 4 for the very first time after you've upgraded it, it will pick up Sublime Text 3's configuration information, its session information, its packages, and just start working. Of course, there will be some differences, because as we talked about today, there's a lot of stuff in there that could potentially mean that some key bindings you have might need to be tweaked based on changes that have been made, or you may be using packages that no longer need to be there because they're now covered by built-in functionality. That's just the growing pains of going from one version to the next, particularly when so many changes have been made in this particular case. Rest assured that everything should be fully compatible. If it's not, do report that as an issue. There's a new item in the help menu that allows you to report a bug directly to the appropriate place, should you have one. Of course, always remember to check to make sure that this hasn't been reported by somebody else, because the developers are pretty busy as it is. One last thing to say about that, of course, is that if you want to run Sublime Text 3 and Sublime Text 4 in parallel, and you want them to have different configuration information, that's entirely possible. There's very easy steps. We've covered it in a previous video, so I'm not going to cover that here because this one's long enough. Check down in the description of the video for the link to that if you'd like to know how to do that. And while you're going down there, use those buttons to thumb, subscribe, and share, and ring the bell notification icon, because this just scratches the surface of what's available in Sublime Text 4. It's now public. Everybody can play with it. If you're not already playing with it, you should. We're going to be talking about it in more videos, and when those happen, I will be here to be your guide. Until then, this is ODatNerd asking you to please have a sublime day.